I'm glad anytime I can talk about how great Hulk is and spend time talking about his life, his legacy with you guys. I'm honored. Thank you.
He was jealous, or that is what Ric Flair believed. For 40 years, he looked around the locker room and he saw it everywhere. He saw it in the eyes of the men who could not beat him. He saw it in the words of the men who tried to tear him down. He saw it in every shoot promo, every cold shoulder, every lawsuit, and every book chapter written to cut him. But the story of those jealous rivals does not begin in the past. It begins in the summer of 2025. It begins with a FaceTime call. It begins with grief. Hulk Hogan died on July 24th, 2025. The wrestling world went quiet in a way it rarely does. Ric Flair appeared on the Ariel Helwani show not long after, and what the audience saw was not the Nature Boy. It was not the man in the robe. It was not the figure with the big hair and the even bigger mouth. It was a man who had lost something he could not replace. You could see the grief sitting on his face like a weight he did not know how to put down. Flair revealed that he had been in contact with Hogan in the final weeks of his life. They had spoken via FaceTime more than once. Flair had tried to warn him about certain business dealings that looked wrong to him, that looked like people taking advantage of a man whose health was failing. Flair reached out because that is what you do when you care about someone. You pick up the phone. You say the thing that needs to be said. You try to protect them, even when protecting them is difficult. And in those same conversations, in those same reflections after Hogan passed, Flair said something he would not have said easily in earlier years. He acknowledged that Hogan was one of the two biggest stars in the history of professional wrestling, alongside Steve Austin, just two people, and Hogan was one of them. The man he had competed against, sparred with politically, resented at times, and rivaled for the soul of this business for decades. One of the two biggest ever. That admission tells you something about what mortality does to a man's ledger. It closes out old scores that had been left open too long. It reminds you that the war you were fighting was, in the end, between two people who understood each other better than almost anyone else in the world could. The thing about being the greatest of your era is that only a handful of people ever know what that actually means from the inside. The travel, the sacrifice, the loneliness of being the main attraction in every building you walk into, night after night, year after year, with no off switch and no real way to explain any of it to someone who has not lived it. Hogan knew, Flair knew. They understood each other in that specific and irreplaceable way, even when they were at war, and now one of them was gone. Flair spoke openly about his own fear in those interviews following Hogan's passing. He talked about looking at Hogan's situation and feeling the weight of his own age. The realization that the era they had both inhabited, the era that had defined professional wrestling as a cultural force, was closing, not just shrinking, closing. The men who had built it were running out of time, and that realization had a way of reordering what felt important and what did not. But here is the thing. When even in grief, even standing at the edge of a loss that shook him, the old fires in Ric Flair did not go cold. Because the story of his life is not a story about one rival. It is a story about 10 of them, 10 names that burned, 10 men whose jealousy, or what Flair called jealousy, shaped the business of professional wrestling for a generation. And if you want to understand where all of that came from, you have to understand the robe. If you are finding this story gripping already, take 2 seconds right now and hit the hype button on this video. Give it some hype. It helps the channel grow, and it lets us keep making content like this. Now let us get deeper into it. The robe was never just a costume. It was a statement. It was Ric Flair walking through the curtain and saying, without a single word, that he existed on a different level to everyone else in that building. The hotels he stayed in, the jets he flew on, the products he used once and threw away. All of it was a message. All of it was designed to put distance between himself and the rest of the card. And that distance had a price. During the peak territory days of the 1980s and early 1990s, Flair was earning between $500,000 and £700,000 a year. In today's money, that is roughly $2.5 million. And he spent it as fast as he earned it. The 5-star hotels were not a luxury. They were the required backdrop for the character. The private jets were not indulgence. They were the necessary transport for a man playing the role of the most important person in the room. The high-end toiletries and hair products, used once and discarded, were the kind of details that spread through locker rooms and became legend. Stories travel fast in a wrestling locker room. They travel faster than the buses most of those wrestlers were catching. And the stories about Flair's spending, about the throwaway products and the fine hotels and the jet travel, hit every mid-card performer right where it was meant to hurt, not not in the wallet, in the pride. Because the lifestyle said something that no one could argue with. It said that Flair existed in a category of his own, and the men fighting to stay on the card knew it. Some of them used it as motivation. A lot of them used it as fuel for something darker. The interesting thing is that Flair knew exactly what he was doing. He was not unaware of the resentment the lifestyle created. He was counting on it. Maori, because a man who makes other men feel small in the hotel lobby, has already done half his work before he even laces up his boots. The robe was not just about being seen as successful. It was about making everyone in the vicinity feel, on a very deep level, that they were not successful enough, that they had not arrived yet, that the top of this business looked exactly like Ric Flair, and they were not that. The psychology behind the spending was real. If you see someone living at a level you cannot reach, it either inspires you or it infuriates you. For many of the mid-card wrestlers in that era, men who were fighting to cover their own travel costs and sleeping in budget motels after long drives through the night, it did the second thing. Flair was not just the champion, he was the symbol of everything that felt out of reach. Soy, a walking reminder of the gap. By the mid-2000s, the financial landscape of wrestling had changed completely. WWE was a corporation now. The money was corporate money, and it flowed to the stars the corporation chose to invest in. Triple H was earning over $2 million a year and had access to the company jet 10 times annually. The Undertaker was on nearly $2 million. John Cena pulled $1.7 million. Shawn Michaels earned over $1 million. And Ric Flair? $508,000 a year. On paper, that is still a comfortable wage. But Flair was still living like a $2 million a year man. The image demanded it. The character required it. He could not step off the robe without stepping out of the identity that had made him who he was. So he kept spending. He kept maintaining the lifestyle that the legend required. Divorces, medical costs, the relentless overhead of being the nature boy, all of it chipped away at the foundation. By 2025, his net worth had settled at around £500,000. The price of the robe paid in full. But that spending, that image, that deliberate gap he maintained between himself and everyone else, it did not just cost him financially. It cost him in a different currency. It put a target on his back that never fully came off. And it fed the resentment of the men who watched him from the other side of that gap. Here are 10 of the names that burned the brightest, listed in descending order from number 10 down to number 1. Number 10, the Ultimate Warrior. Flair's problem with the Ultimate Warrior was not complicated. He did not believe the Warrior was a real wrestler. Full stop. No qualification. In Flair's view of the business, you earned your place through craft. Through decades of learning how to work a crowd, how to sell an injury, how to build a match minute by minute until the audience was hanging on every movement. You earned it through the kind of work that left you exhausted and proud and ready to do it all again tomorrow night in a different town. The Warrior had not done that. In Flair's assessment, the Warrior had a remarkable physique, a loud entrance, a running splash, and the marketing machine of Vince McMahon behind him. That was the foundation of his stardom. Not technique, not locker room knowledge, not the kind of craft that Flair had dedicated his entire adult life to building and protecting. Was Flair said the Warrior and performers like him were green with envy because they knew the truth, even if they did not say it. They knew they did not have what the Nature Boy had. The locker room respect, the ability to go 60 minutes with anyone on the card, the ring psychology that could carry a crowd through every emotion in a single match. To Flair, the Warrior was a momentary star. There was a flash of brightness and then it faded. Flair saw himself as the eternal version, the kind of legend that does not dim with time or trend. It is a compelling argument on the surface, but look at what it is really doing. When Flair dismisses the Warrior, he is not just offering a professional opinion, he is drawing a boundary. He is saying that the kind of stardom built on personality and presentation is lesser than the kind built on technical mastery. He is protecting the brand, making sure that the rules of this business, as he defines them, keep him at the top of the hierarchy. That is not honest analysis, that is territory protection wearing the mask of professional standards. And the deeper irony is this: Flair built his own legend on personality as much as on technique. The robe, the strut, the woo, the limousine riding lifestyle. These were not just the packaging around the craft. They were a central part of why people cared. If personality and presentation were lesser tools in the box, then Flair had to account for his own use of them. He never quite did. The Warrior was a convenient target for a criticism that, if applied consistently, one would have come back around. Number 9, Magnum TA. This one sits differently to all the others on this list. Magnum TA was not Flair's enemy in any traditional sense. He was not someone who attacked him in promos or wrote damaging things about him in books. He was the chosen successor, the man the NWA had decided would carry this business forward when Flair eventually stepped aside, the heir apparent. And then in 1986, a car accident ended his career at the very moment he was reaching his peak. Flair has spoken about this situation within the wider context of the jealousy that followed him throughout his career. He points to Magnum and others like him as examples of how the business consumed people, and how the ones who were consumed could sometimes project their pain at the ones who survived and kept going. He stayed at the top, and he kept working. He remained the man long after Magnum had been forced to step away from the only life both of them had ever truly known. There is genuine emotion in how Flair tells this, and there is genuine sadness in the story itself. Magnum TA was a brilliant talent whose career was taken from him by an accident on a road, not by any failure of ability or dedication. He deserved better than fate gave him, but listen carefully to the framework Flair builds around it. He survived, therefore the envy directed at him is understandable. He continued when others could not, therefore the resentment from people on the sidelines was a natural consequence of his own endurance. Even in a story about a young man whose career was stolen from him by tragedy, Flair manages to position his continued success as the central fact. Once the longevity becomes a form of ownership, staying on top the longest becomes the same as deserving to stay there. That is not a small distinction to let pass without comment. Number 8, Dusty Rhodes, Jim Crockett. Promotions in the 1980s was the most important wrestling territory in North America, and inside that territory, two men held most of the real power. Ric Flair, the champion, Dusty Rhodes, the booker. The rivalry between them was never just about what happened inside the ring. It was about who controlled the story of the NWA and whose vision of that story would define the entire era. Rhodes had the booking pen. That meant he decided who came out of matches looking strong. He decided which feuds got the most time and the biggest moments. He decided how the title picture was built and presented. And Flair believed that Rhodes used that power to book himself into the strongest positions on the card, sometimes at the direct expense of the championship credibility that Flair was supposed to carry. The accusation was not subtle. It was a straight claim that the booker was serving himself before he was serving the product. Flair read the whole rivalry through the lens of jealousy. He felt that Rhodes envied the technical work rate that made Flair's matches the benchmark for this business. The ability to have a 5-star match on any given night with anyone on the roster, in any town, in front of any crowd. Rhodes, in his own version of events, felt that Flair was too locked into his personal legacy to ever truly commit to building the promotion as a whole entity rather than as a vehicle for his own story. Two enormous egos in one company. The result was a creative and political war that shaped what NWA television looked and felt like for years. What it reveals about Flair is that his obsession with legacy and position made genuine partnership almost impossible to sustain. When the man you are building something with is simultaneously keeping score of every creative decision, every title reign, and every moment of perceived disrespect, you are not really building together. You are managing a permanent conflict dressed up as collaboration. The Rhodes situation also points to something that runs through this whole list. Flair had a very particular relationship with power. When he held it, he saw himself as the rightful holder of it. When someone else held it, he tended to view their use of it as suspicious and self-serving. Rhodes used the booking pen. Bischoff used the corporate structure. Both were accused of abusing their position to hold Flair down, but Flair himself sat on the WCW booking committee and made decisions that affected other people's careers. That part of the story gets told much more quietly. Number 7, Shane Douglas. If Dusty Rhodes represented the friction inside the system, Shane Douglas represented its complete and deliberate rejection. Douglas came up through WCW in the early 1990s and left feeling like the deck had been arranged against him from the start. Like the space at the top of this business was carefully protected by the men already occupying, and that no amount of talent or effort was going to shift that arrangement while those men held the real power. In 1994, Douglas made the single most dramatic statement of his career. When he stood in the ring with the NWA World Heavyweight Championship belt in his hands, and he put it on the floor, not to hand it to someone else, not as part of a creative story. He threw it down as an act of rejection, as a declaration that everything that belt represented, the tradition, the legacy, the whole system built around it, was something he wanted nothing to do with. He announced the birth of Extreme Championship Wrestling and walked away from the thing Flair had spent his entire career protecting and defining. He then spent years making sure the world understood why. He called Flair Rick Flair, a deliberate mocking play on his real surname, designed to puncture the carefully constructed polish of the legend. He called him a liar. He said that Flair used the language of mentorship as a front while secretly working to ensure that no one who posed a genuine threat ever got close enough to become one, that the open hand on camera always had a closed fist operating behind it. Flair's standard response was to call all of it jealousy. But here's a question worth sitting with. Douglas built an entire wrestling promotion, an entire professional identity around the opposition to Ric Flair and what Flair represented. That is not a casual grievance. You do not construct construct a career out of attacking something unless that something has real weight in the industry. The sustained nature of Douglas's campaign suggests he was not just venting, he was making a case, and enough people were listening for it to matter. Number 6, Scott Steiner, February 7, 2000, Tulsa, Oklahoma. Aired Monday Nitro. Scott Steiner walked to that microphone with no interest in saying what he had been asked to say. He had a real target. He had a real grievance, and he let it go in front of the whole world. He called Flair an old bastard. He claimed Flair was responsible for Stone Cold Steve Austin being let go from WCW back in the mid-1990s. He told the television audience that whenever Ric Flair walked through that curtain, people reached for their remotes and changed the channel. It was loud. It was raw. It was completely unscripted, and it was clearly built from something that had been burning for a long time before it finally came out. The historical record does not fully support Steiner's claims. Dave Meltzer, who has spent decades closely documenting this business, noted that the accusations about Austin were mostly exaggerated. When the decision to release Austin from WCW had been a corporate call made by Eric Bischoff, not a political move orchestrated by Flair. The idea that Flair was driving audiences away from the television was also hard to back up with actual viewership numbers. He remained a consistent and dependable draw in that era, but accuracy was never really the engine driving that promo. The engine was the feeling underneath. Steiner was saying, loudly and in public, what many of the performers in that building had been saying to each other privately for years, that Flair's political grip on the main event, the protection he enjoyed from the company structure, the way younger and more athletic performers kept finding doors quietly closed against them, had become a real obstacle to what WCW could have been. Steiner was giving voice to a locker room frustration that had no other outlet. Steiner was suspended for the outburst, but the Big Papa Pump character became bigger because of it. He was now the man who told the truths no one else had the nerve to say out loud on live television. Flair called it jealousy, but at a certain point, when multiple people from different eras and different backgrounds keep arriving at the same complaint about the same man, the most honest response is to stop dismissing the critics and start examining what they are pointing at. That is hard for any man to do. For a man who had spent 4 decades as the undisputed main event, it was impossible. The thing about shoot promos in that era is that they only landed when they touched something real. An audience can feel the difference between performance anger and actual anger. Steiner's promo landed. It got talked about for 20 years afterward. It got replayed and analyzed and remembered as one of the most electric moments in Monday Nitro's history. That kind of resonance does not come from nowhere. It came from the fact that even people at home watching on their television screens could feel that the frustration underneath the words was genuine. Flair's political position in WCW was a known fact. Steiner just said it louder than anyone else had dared to. Number 5, Eric Bischoff. Ric Flair described Eric Bischoff in a very specific way. He called him an obnoxious, overbearing ass. That is a quote, and it is instructive because it tells you something important about the nature of this conflict. Flair could accept critique from people he respected as peers. What he could not accept, and never did accept, was being managed by someone he did not believe understood the business from the inside. Bischoff was the head of WCW. He ran the whole operation, and Flair, deep in his bones, never fully made peace with that. In Flair's view, he was the legend. He was the draw. He was the man who had built the credibility this business ran on. Bischoff was a television executive, a suit who made decisions from behind a desk without understanding what it cost to do what the wrestlers did every night between those ropes. The breaking point arrived in April 1998. Flair did not show up to a WCW Thunder taping. He did not miss it for personal leisure or to make a point. He missed it to watch his son compete in an amateur wrestling match. The kind of thing a father does for his child. Bischoff's response was to suspend him and file a lawsuit. There were reports that Bischoff threatened to bankrupt Flair's family through the legal process, not to resolve a dispute, to punish, to make clear who held the authority and what happened to those who ignored it. The targeting of Flair's family finances was a specific choice. There are many ways to discipline an employee who misses a work commitment. You fine them, you suspend them, you have a direct conversation. Using the courts to threaten a man's family home and financial security is a different category of response. It is the kind of response that does not just address the missed taping. It is designed to break the person, to make them feel the full weight of corporate power pressing down on them. Flair felt that, and he never forgot it. Flair read this as a corporate machine being used to crush someone who still commanded genuine loyalty from the audience. The feud eventually found its way onto television when Flair returned in September 1998, turned into a worked shoot storyline for the cameras. But the real hatred behind it never got turned off when the show ended. As recently as 2025, Flair spoke publicly about Bischoff again after feeling disrespected by things Bischoff had said in wrestling documentary interviews. Even as every other old rivalry found a way to soften, this one did not. It remains unresolved by early 2026. A reminder reminder that Flair's competitive memory does not fade at the same rate in every direction. Number 4, Bruno Sammartino. Bruno Sammartino held the WWF title for nearly a decade. He was the gold standard of a very particular kind of wrestling legend, dignified, stoic, a genuine role model who believed deeply in what it meant to represent a championship. He believed the title came with responsibilities, that a champion owed something to the audience, that the figure carrying the belt should be someone worth looking up to. And when he looked at Ric Flair, he did not see that. Sammartino was openly critical of the WWE Hall of Fame for years. He called it a scam and a joke. He believed it dishonored the genuine achievement it was supposed to recognize by including people whose public conduct was not worthy of the award. When they crossed paths at a backstage event during the 2000s, Sammartino famously refused to engage with Flair. He walked past without acknowledgement. The snub was deliberate and visible, which meant it was also a statement to everyone watching. The stated basis for Sammartino's disdain was conduct. He pointed to specific incidents, including a notorious and widely discussed accusation involving Flair's behavior on an airplane, as evidence that Flair had behaved in ways that disgraced the office of champion. Sammartino had spent his whole career as a symbol of something clean. He was not willing to pretend that the man across from him had upheld the same standard. And the cold shoulder in that corridor spoke more clearly than any interview ever could. It said that in Sammartino's view, the WWE Hall of Fame was supposed to represent something, and Ric Flair's presence in it was evidence that it had stopped representing that thing. Flair interpreted all of it as jealousy. An old man from a rigid era, unable to accept that wrestling had evolved, that new characters and new styles had reached audiences that Sammartino's tradition never could. In Flair's framing, his longevity across the 80s and 90s and beyond proved his point. Sammartino had his moment and then stepped away. Flair kept adapting and surviving. In Sammartino's framing, the behavior on the way to that survival disqualified the argument entirely. Number 3, Mick Foley. There is no clean version of the history between Ric Flair and Mick Foley. No way to tell it without getting into the ugly parts. And it started not on television, not in a book, but in a room where decisions got made. A booking meeting. In the early 1990s, Flair sat on the WCW booking committee. He was one of the people who voted on who got pushed and who did not. And he looked at Mick Foley and he decided without apparent hesitation that Foley was not a future top star. He did not push for Foley when the doors were open. He voted his own interests, as he almost always did, and Foley was on the wrong side of that. Foley held on to that for years, quietly, carefully, and then in print. In his 1999 book, Have a Nice Day, he wrote that Flair was every bit as bad on the booking side as he was great on the wrestling side. That is a very precise instrument of criticism. It acknowledges the ring ability with one hand while cutting the man's professional judgment to pieces with the other. It landed exactly where it was aimed, and Flair felt it. He responded in his own 2004 book. He called Foley a glorified stuntman, and he said hardcore wrestling was a place where people hid when they lacked the genuine skills this business required. He claimed Foley could not punch and could not kick, that the barbed wire and the weapons in the falls were substitutes for ability. This was not careful professional analysis. It was a personal attack built out of technical language, designed to reduce Foley to something smaller than he was. The heat became physical. In 2004, backstage, Flair attacked Foley after a perceived insult. There were no cameras for this one. This was just two men who had gotten under each other's skin in a way that neither could manage from a distance. And then they used every bit of that real hatred to make extraordinary television. Their 2006 program, including an I Quit match, was fueled by genuine emotion on both sides. The best wrestling frequently is. The ending is the best one on this list. By the time the WWE 2K14 Legends panel came around, they were laughing together. Flair eventually called Foley a great friend. The stuntman and the workhorse found something real on the other side of the fight. But the gatekeeper conduct, the way Flair exercised his booking power to shape whose career moved forward and who stalled, does not disappear because the friendship that followed was genuine. Number 2, Bret Hart. Two men, both certain they were the finest technical wrestler of their era, both making a strong case, and both completely unable to hear the other's argument without treating it as an attack. Bret Hart wrote in his autobiography that Flair could not improvise, that he performed the same match every night, whoever the opponent was. To a man who prided himself on reading a crowd in real time and adjusting his work accordingly, that criticism carried significant weight. It was saying that behind the legend and the reputation, the Nature Boy was running the same well-worn formula night after night, that the celebrated hour-long matches were not spontaneous masterpieces, but rehearsed routines played to the same blueprint on every occasion. Flair's counter was to call Hart a douche, a man who took himself far too seriously, who lacked the flamboyant charisma required to be a true NWA champion in the tradition Flair had built. He argued that title reigns were not built on ring work alone, They were built on magnetism, on the ability to make a crowd want to watch you simply because you were there. And by that measure, in Flair's view, Hart came up short. They threw sharper words in public over the years. Hart mocked Flair for bleeding excessively. Flair questioned whether Hart had the ability to draw a paying crowd on his own merits. Both men were trying to define the other one in terms that diminished them. Both had enough genuine ability to make the other's words sting. Look at the pattern underneath all of this. Every time someone offered Flair a real criticism, every time someone identified a genuine behavior and named it accurately, his first move was to flip the table, to declare that the critic was motivated by envy. That is a reliable way to stay completely unchanged by anything anyone ever says to you. It is also the way a man stays exactly who he already is for the rest of his life, with no external information allowed to revise the picture. The peace came slowly, helped along by their families. Charlotte Flair and Natalya working together in NXT gave the two old rivals a natural reason to put the public battle down. By 2026, Hart and Flair were close friends. Hart attended Flair's last match and showed up to support him in person. That moment was not small. It was a man who had publicly questioned Flair's ability, integrity, and conduct, choosing to be in the front row for the final chapter. That means something. The years of cuts and countercuts were finally laid aside, but the road there was longer than it needed to be, made longer by Flair's consistent unwillingness to receive a single piece of criticism as anything other than an act of jealousy against the throne, made longer by two men who were talented enough to make every slight feel worth responding to, and stubborn enough to keep the responses coming for years. The friendship they found at the end of it was real. It just arrived later than it should have. Number 1, Hulk Hogan. And we come back to where we started, because every road in this story leads back to the same place. The biggest rivalry, the one that defined the era more completely than any of the others. The one that was still unresolved in a quiet and significant way on the day Ric Flair got the news that his old rival was gone. Hulk Hogan and Ric Flair were the two largest figures professional wrestling had ever produced, and for a significant stretch of time, they occupied the same industry without ever fully sharing it. Hogan had transformed wrestling into a mainstream entertainment phenomenon. He was on cereal boxes and Saturday morning cartoons. He was in living rooms that had never seen a wrestling match before he arrived. He changed the scale of the entire business by making it appealing to people who would never have called themselves wrestling fans. Flair was something different. He was the workhorse king of the NWA tradition, the man who could main event 5 nights in a week across 5 different towns and make every single one of those nights feel like the most important match the crowd had ever witnessed. He was the technical standard by which the whole industry measured itself. Different blueprints, different philosophies. And the moment they shared a company, the comparison between those two blueprints became unavoidable. When Flair arrived in the WWF in 1991, every fan who followed this business knew what the obvious next step was. Flair versus Hogan. The workhorse against the mainstream phenomenon. WrestleMania 8 felt like the moment it would finally be settled, and then it did not happen. Hogan faced Sid Justice. Flair faced Randy Savage. The dream match that everyone wanted was replaced by 2 separate bouts that neither man strictly needed. Flair has always placed the blame clearly. He says Hogan did not want the match, that Hogan used his position, his relationship with the decision makers, his enormous political weight in that locker room to keep the match from happening, to protect his image from a confrontation that might cost him something he was not willing to risk. Bret Hart's testimony supports this version of events. When Hart said that Hogan repeatedly used his influence with Eric Bischoff in WCW to derail the momentum of competitors and block them from getting close to his level. In Flair's framing, Hogan was the purest example of star power built on protection. A man who had accumulated so much influence that he could rearrange the card around himself, redirect the spotlight when it moved towards someone he felt threatened by, and eliminate competition before it became actual competition. And Flair labeled all of that jealousy. He said Hogan was threatened by the locker room respect that technical mastery earned, by the tradition Flair represented. The irony is thick here, because Flair himself was accused of the same thing by nearly every name on this list. The political clout, the protection of his own position, the quiet management of who got elevated and who stayed where they were. Flair pointing at Hogan and calling it jealousy-fueled self-protection is a man describing a mirror. Both of them had built their careers partly on the ability to keep challengers at arm's length. Both had used their relationships with promoters and bookers to shape outcomes in their favor. The difference in Flair's mind was that his self-protection was justified by the quality underneath it. He was genuinely that good. Whether Hogan was as good was beside the point. What mattered to Flair was that he had earned every protection he used, while Hogan had merely purchased it with mainstream fame. But even as Flair builds that case, the irony is sitting right next to him. Flair himself was not above using influence to protect his position, and the same locker room that pointed fingers at Hogan for protecting his spot had been pointing similar fingers at Flair for years. The scorekeeping ran in in multiple directions. And Flair, the man who called jealousy at every turn, was never entirely without a score of his own to settle. Then July 24th, 2025 arrived, and everything looked different. Flair grieved in public, and the grief was real. There was no performance in it, no version of the Nature Boy visible in that television appearance. Just a man processing the loss of someone who had understood the particular loneliness of being the biggest star in a room full of people who wanted to take that title from you. The old scores between them suddenly felt very small and very far away. He said Hogan was one of the two biggest stars in the history of this business. Alongside Steve Austin, that is the kind of acknowledgement that does not come easy for a man who spent decades insisting no one had ever truly matched him. But when the person you competed against is no longer there to hear it, the competitive pride loosens its grip in a way it never does while the rivalry is still alive. This is the uncomfortable truth that sits at the heart of all 10 stories on this list. Flair spent so long calling every criticism jealousy, so long defending the robe, throne, and the legend, that even genuine and accurate observations about his conduct got buried under the weight of that label. The men who said he used booking power to manage who rose and who stalled, were they jealous or were they right? The men who said his ego governed the company more effectively than any title belt, were they envious or were they accurate? There is a quieter side to all of this that deserves to be acknowledged. Flair was also a man who lifted people. He took Sting from a young surfer gimmick to a genuine icon in a single 45-minute match in 1988. He wrestled that match to a draw and made Sting look like he belonged at the very top of the company. That was a choice. He did not have to give that much. He stood next to Triple H in Evolution and helped teach a generation what main event carrying looked like. He shaped Randy Orton into the Legend Killer, helping craft a persona that would carry Orton through decades of main events. He helped Batista earn the credibility to become a genuine main event star when the crowd was still deciding whether to believe in him. He worked with AJ Styles in TNA to help him develop as a heel performer with microphone ability to match his in-ring brilliance. He chose Andrade as his partner for his final match in 2022, using his remaining star power to honor his family. He praised Will Ospreay publicly in 2024 with genuine warmth. He used his own remaining heat to fuel Charlotte's rise rather than keeping it for himself. But even this generosity has a shadow. When your blessing is what opens doors, when your support is the mechanism by which certain careers are elevated, the kindness and the control are wound together in a way that is hard to fully separate. Flair needed allies. He needed the next generation standing alongside him to keep the aura alive. The mentorship served him as much as it served the people he mentored. By early 2026, most of the old wars are over. Bret Hart is a close friend. Mick Foley is a great friend. Most of the 10 names on this list have found their way to peace, or at the very least to silence. Most, but not all. Eric Bischoff remains the exception. The 2025 friction over documentary commentary has not resolved itself. That particular competitive fire refuses to cool, and perhaps it never fully will. Some scores in the Nature Boy's ledger may simply be permanent entries, carried forward past every reconciliation and every reminder of mortality. Because the ego that built the legend was also the ego that never learned to fully forgive. The passing of Hogan was a reckoning for an entire generation. The surviving legends of that era looking at each other across the years and beginning to understand that the time left is genuinely finite. That the scores which feel urgent right now will stop feeling urgent when there is no one left to settle them with. The gold and the glory and the politics all fade into the same color eventually. What stays is the work. What stays is the matches. What stays is the memory of a man in a robe who walked through that curtain and made the whole building believe for the next 60 minutes that they were watching the most important thing happening anywhere on earth. In the end, the jealousy of 10 rivals may be the most accurate measurement available of what Ric Flair actually was. You do not spend decades attacking something that carries no real weight. You do not build a whole promotion around rejecting a legacy that means nothing. You do not deliver a live television outburst about a man who is not worth the anger. The intensity of the resentment was proof of the size of the thing it was directed at. For over 4 decades, Ric Flair wore the robe. He paid every penny of the price it cost. He made enemies and he made icons. He protected his position and he lifted the next generation when it suited him. He kept score and he eventually let most of it go. And every man who watched him, whether with admiration or with something much darker burning in their chest, knew the same truth deep down. He was the man. And to be the man, you have to beat the man. Most of them never did.